Here is our next case study. You have a patient, Mary, which is a 72-year-old female with a history of hypertension and diabetes. Recently admitted to the hospital for a 5-day stay to pneumonia. She was treated with the antibiotics amoxicillin and clavulanate. Presenting symptoms. 3 days after hospital discharge, Mary experiences watery diarrhea occurring 5 to 6 times per day, abdominal cramping and mild nausea, but there are no fevers or chills. So medical history, she had a previous hospitalization 6 months ago for a urinary tract infection. She was treated with cephalexin and developed C. difficile infection requiring oral metronidazole for 10 days. No history of inflammatory bowel disease or recent surgery. What's going on? Let's ask the LMM what it thinks. I put in the data and asked it, what disease does it have? What disease does she have? Right? And it says the patient is likely suffering from antibiotic-associated diarrhea, and that is correct. And it correctly identifies Clostridium difficile. C. diff is becoming more and more of a problem. So, Clostridium difficile, what are the characteristics of it? First of all, the Clostridia. These are gram-positive endospore-forming strict anaerobes and obligate fermenters. Because of their spore formation, they are ubiquitous in the environment. Clostridia in the soil live as saprophytes, degrading organic material. They can also be found in water as part of the normal microbiota of some humans. There are pathogenic Clostridia that can cause several types of infections. They can invade the skin and soft tissues of the body. Some can cause food poisoning, such as C. perfringens and C. botulinum. Some can cause antibiotic-associated diarrhea and colitis. Why is this species such a problem? First, they are able to survive adverse conditions in the environment because they form endospores. Second, because of their rapid growth. For example, Clostridium perfringens has a growth rate of 6.5 minutes. Right? That's a generation time of 6.5 minutes in rich medium, making it possible for this microbe to grow rapidly in improperly prepared foods. Within an hour, it can get up into the billions per gram. Many of the species produce toxins, and some of them are very potent. Tetanus toxin and botulinum toxin are lethal to humans with nanogram quantities able to kill. 78 nanograms for a botulinum toxin, 195 nanograms for tetanus toxin. That is nothing. The thing that we're going to talk about is Clostridium difficile, and it's probably the most significant infection right now. It was not identified as an infectious agent until 1978. Today, it's the main cause of infectious diarrhea after hospitalization and antibiotic use, and that was the case for Mary. There's an estimated 13 of 1,000 acute care patients will get this, 101 cases per 100,000, and about 500,000 cases per year in the U.S. 4,533 deaths per year, making it an important cause of mortality in the U.S. Incidence of complications from this type of infection are relatively high. Originally, it was mainly a problem for the elderly, but they're starting to see increased cases in the young with no previous antibiotic use. That's a concern. The disease is really complicated. C. diff is a complicated infection for humans. It appears to be part of the normal flora and the normal microbiota of some people and causes no problems. Some strains are non-toxigenic and colonize humans asymptomatically. However, some strains produce toxins that cause mild to severe bloating and abnormal abdominal pain. In some patients with a strong IgG response to the toxins, they are able to control their infection. In the absence of a strong immune response, C. diff pathogenesis occurs, including fever, leukocytosis, which means high white blood cell count, pseudomembranous colitis, which is inflammation of the colon caused by C. difficile, and toxic megacolon, which is a large dilation of the colon causing bulging. You can also have sepsis shock, which just means spreading into the system, the bloodstream, and death. Now, part of the pathogenesis of this organism are two toxins, TCD-A and TCD-B. Both have two domains, A and B domains. They damage cells by inactivating RAC and Rho GTPases, and these are important cell signaling molecules. They cause cell rounding and apoptosis, and this will cause inflammation and the swelling and all of the other problems you can have with this disease. It is important to prevent the spread of C. diff, especially in healthcare settings. These behaviors can decrease the spread of the illness. Good hand hygiene for all health workers and the patients. Disinfecting common equipment, for example, electronic thermometer handles. The use of sporicidal hypochlorite, which will kill the spores of C. diff. Changing antibiotics prescriptions. Penicillin and vancomycin lower the risk when you're treating an infection, while cephalosporins and clindamycin increase the incidence. And you'll note that Mary was treated with clindamycin. The illness is often brought on by treatment with antibiotics, and it was somewhat ironic that a typical treatment is further antibiotic treatment. In 20% of cases where you treat with antibiotics, there is a recurrence of illness. Surgery to remove the affected region in the colon is sometimes employed in extreme infections, but there is a new treatment, or relatively new. It's not really that new anymore, but it's taking on more significance now, called fecal microbiota transplantation, and a treatment that I'll talk about on the next slide. This is a paper by Michael Sadowsky and his lab. What they found is that when you treat a patient with antibiotics, you decrease the diversity, because the antibiotics don't just kill whatever infection you're trying to treat, they also kill a bunch of organisms that are part of the normal microbiota. That changes the bile acid metabolism in your colon. So you secrete bile into your gut, into your colon, right? The bile is then metabolized by your microbiota into secondary bile acids. These secondary bile acids prevent the growth of C. difficile. Since you've gotten rid of these secondary bile acids, the C. difficile will germinate and grow. And you can see that patients that are infected and have C. difficile infections will have a very different microbiota than other healthy patients. The way to treat them is to treat them with donor microbiota. So basically you take the poop of a donor, you process it, and you then inoculate these patients with it. Now, initially, this was done with enemas, right? You take and you restore the gut microbiota directly, and you see that here's the donor microbiota, here's the people that are sick with C. diff. You give them the donor microbiota, you give them time, and it cures the infection. 85% of cases were cured just by fecal microbiome transplants. So this seems like a great way to treat it, right? Amazingly, the American Medical Association and the CDC still recommend antibiotic treatment for first cases and only suggest microbiome transplant is the first-line treatment with vancomycin fails. Partly, I think this is because it's simpler and enemas are, not very attractive to people. FMT, however, is finally beginning to gain some traction. There was a significant resistance to FMT, fecal microbiome transplant, due to the ick factor of ingesting someone else's fecal material. In addition, enemas or tubes through the nose, which is another way to inoculate the colon, weren't really ideal. However, recent advances have resulted in the formulation of oral formulations, and that's sort of described here, and I give you a link and an article on it if you're interested. One thing that I find a little outrageous about it is the company wants to charge $17,500 for a treatment, which personally I think is a ridiculous price. We now move on to another infection. But before we talk about that, I want to explain a few things about cancer. Cancer is in controlled cell growth, and many different cell types can become cancerous if they have lost tumor suppressant genes, become less differentiated, or acquire mutations in cell cycle genes. Current estimates are that between 10 to 20% of all cancer types are caused by viruses, but our knowledge of viruses is limited, so this number may grow. Proto-oncogenes, onco equals cancerous. These are normal genes involved in the cell cycle, but are normally highly regulated. Mutations that cause them to be unregulated or upregulated, i.e. turned on, is half the recipe for cancer. The other half is mutations in tumor suppressor genes, the genes whose products act like checkpoints to stop unregulated cell growth. If these roadblocks are impaired by mutation, it will encourage cancerous growth. Now, the other part of this is that there are viruses that cause cancer. Many types of viruses will disrupt these oncogenes, and this has been found to lead to cancer. They are listed at the lower right. All of them but HCLV6, the human T-cell lymphotrophic virus, are double-stranded DNA viruses. HCLV6 is a single-stranded RNA retrovirus. It brings along its own enzyme to convert its single-stranded RNA back into DNA. They cause cancer in different ways. Some bring oncogenes with them, many disrupt tumor suppressor genes, or they interact with tumor suppressor gene products. In this lecture, we are going to talk about cervical cancer and the human papillomavirus. The human papillomavirus is a double-stranded DNA virus. There are about 100 types of human papillomaviruses. It has a double-stranded circular DNA genome of about 8,000 base pairs. Papillomaviruses are not enveloped and have a icosahedral capsid. Types are tissue-specific, infecting, for example, the skin or mucosa. Replication is determined by host cell differentiation state. Cervical cancer is associated with just a few types of HPV, mostly HPV 16 and 18. HPV may be the world's most prevalent sexually transmitted disease, with an estimated 20 million cases in the US. The virus is acquired by close contact. HPV is present in 99.7% of all cervical cancers, mostly 16, 18, but also 31, 45, 6, and 11. Cervical cancer is the second leading cause of cancer death for women in the US, so this is a big deal. HPV can also cause penile, anal, head, and neck cancer in men, so it's not just a concern for women. A pap smear is used to diagnose aberrant cells and catch cervical cancer early. Growth of the virus inside cells can eventually lead to integration into host DNA. Integration of HPV causes a loss of negative feedback control of oncogenes. E6 and E7 have activities that encourage this, and you can see that as they replicate in cells, if they insert into the host DNA, E6 and E7 are on the edge, and they can cause disruptions in these oncogenes that then lead to cancer. HPV is the most commonly diagnosed sexually transmitted infection in the US. Many experts think that everyone has been exposed, but since most infections are transient, it is undetected. HPV virus interacts with tumor suppressor proteins. Recently, an HPV vaccine has been developed that prevents infection by this illness. Unfortunately, less than half of US teens complete the HPV vaccination. 43% get the full set of shots, while over 80% get Tdap and meningitis vaccines at the same age. So people are reluctant to get this vaccine, and it's unfortunate because it can prevent cancer. And here is the evidence. They started doing research on this, and the CDC began recommending the HPV vaccine for young women in 2006. and it has been since expanded to young men. This graph shows the important effect it has been having on the decrease in the incidence of the disease. If you look at the incidence of invasive cervical cancer, and we look at different cohorts, cohort 4 here entered the study at age 24.5. So this is after they were sexually active. Cohort 5 entered the study at age 20 to 25 and got the vaccine at 17 to 18 years old. Cohort 6 entered the study at 24.5 and got the vaccine at 15 to 16. And cohort 7 entered the study at 24.5 years of age and got the vaccine at 12 to 13 years of age. And you can see the incidence of cervical cancer, cumulative incidence per 100,000. In the control group, cohort 4, you see a typical rise in cervical cancer over time as they get older. In cohort 5, this has been decreased because of the people that got the vaccine before they were sexually active and prevented infection with HPV. And as the ages got younger and younger, this has become more and more effective. It sure looks like cohort 7 is going to have almost no incidence of cervical cancer, which is a great thing. So the question to you is, would you require the HPV vaccine, or do you still leave it up to people to decide? I think in this case, most people would say no. People have a right to decide what they want, and honestly, the children should also be involved in this because they're old enough to help in that decision. It probably is controversial to require the HPV, but education campaigns should be undertaken. In this case, I think they really should be. And so ends our coverage of human papillomavirus.